This is TWiT. All right, let's talk mash, baby.
Well, we've gone through the process of growing barley and harvesting it, getting it to malt, to actually cause it to grow, to turn green, then drying it, and then grinding it to grist, which is that mixture of hull and the hearts, and as well as the flour. So now you have your grist, and you've got to now extract the sugar from it. And so this is mashing. And so it's moved over to a mash tun. And a mash tun, traditional ones are cast iron. Sometimes they have copper tops. The modern ones are all, of course, all stainless steel. And they have a false bottom on them that has a layer of mesh so that water can drain through it and out through a drain. And the grist is spread very evenly across the bottom of the mash tun. And then you soak water through it to get the sugars out. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because, malting has converted some of the sugars in the seed, some of those carbohydrates, into sugar, but not all of them. There are many more long chain carbohydrates that can be converted into sugar. And that process is done with one of the very first enzymes we ever understood to exist, diatase. Amylase, specifically with barley, is the type of diatase that hydrolyzes carbohydrates into sugars. And barley happens to have amylase in it. I mean, amylase is also in your mouth. But,
I thought the sugars came from bacteria.
Well, these are the enzymes that break down the carbohydrates that are in the grist.
So it's not because I know I guess that's for fermentation. But I thought
we're going to get into the yeast part of this later.
Yeah. But I thought bacteria made the sugar. So it is actually an enzyme. And where does the enzyme come from?
The enzyme amylase actually exists in the barley already. In the normal process of germination of a seed, amylase is used to break down the sugars to grow the plant.
Right. That's why we sprout seeds, so they're more nutritious. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Because we simplify the sugars.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go further down the path in mashing. So we've ground into grist that malt, and now we're going to introduce water to it. And they typically bring water to it at about 62 to 65 degrees centigrade, so about 143 to 149 degrees in the measurements of the oppressors. And that water is hot enough to activate the enzyme without actually killing it. So you maximize the enzymatic reaction to break down those carbohydrates. The rate you put the water in is played with. Different distilleries care about how fast they add the water. It's only going to extract a certain amount of sugar in the initial pass. So often on what they call the first water, they'll cycle that water back into the mash tun again to increase the sugar concentrations. And after it's gone through a bit, they put that water in very carefully. You don't want to create gaps in the mesh. You want to keep the grist evenly spread across. That whole grinding part of the grist, you don't want too much flour because it kind of turns into porridge and blocks up the mash. And so eventually, that as that water is moving through, they'll put it in a holding tank, a thing called the undertun.
You got your mash tun and your undertun.
And then your undertun. That's right. And so then they'll do a second water. And the second water, so they raise the temperature a bit. Now it's about 75 degrees, about 167 or so. And that gets more sugar out at the expense of damaging the enzymes. That's all right. The enzymes have kind of done their thing in the initial extraction. And so actually it's called the underback tank. So there's typically you do 2 washes with some recirculation to extract that sugary water as much as possible. And this is the stuff they call wort.
Wort, W-O-R-T.
W-O-R-T. At every step we've done so far with the barley and the malting and so forth is exactly the same as making beer. So beer and whiskey, whiskey is just what beer wants to be when it grows up in the first place. So, you've gotten to the wort phase and you store that in the underback tank because it's a bit too hot to be moved over to fermentation. Yeast like about 30 degrees centigrade, and this stuff's 60 plus. So you want to hold it for those first 2 waterings, but you're not done back on the mash tun. You've now filled the underback. That's the stuff that's going to go on to be wort. And now you'll do sparging. And sparging, they raise the temperature even higher in the water. So now you're getting into 75, 85, 90 degree points. They'll do three or a third and a fourth wash. And those sugars are not going to go into the underback. That water is then reserved for the next batch that's going to go into the mash tun. So that when they start the water's already a bit sugared from that initial passes. And the mash that's left behind now, they actually turn into feed, cattle feed called draff. They'll dry it and pack it, and it's nutritious for animals. Some places even will pack it down and burn it to be used as sort of energy as well. The mash tun itself is, these are really big now. When we talk about modern whiskey making, which goes back to the middle 1800s, really the Victorian age, they were mostly, you'd use cast iron tanks for this. They also stir the mash while they're passing the water through it because they want to maximize extraction, but they don't want to stir it too much. There's a whole game with different distilleries of how much you stir it because some places are very concerned about having clear wort, just clear sugary water. And some think you want some of that material in the wort as well. They talk about how cereally you want your wort. It has more of the grain flavors will be carried into the whiskey, as opposed to getting a very clear sugar. It's going to make a very smooth or a lighter whiskey. So different distilleries have different rules around all of these things. The old Victorian machinery is beautiful to look at. I've been to a bunch of the distilleries that have them. They call them rakes, but they're basically arms that reach into the barrel and rotate and stir the grist up and keep the mash mixing to increase sugar extraction. The modern technique called the Lauter technique is very German. It's from beer making. It's all stainless steel, and they use Lauters, which are rods that extend down into the mash, and they have rotating blades on them. And they can control the mixing very precisely so you get exactly the cloudiness of the wort that you want.
I always have the same reaction to this, though. I'm fascinated by the history of this. Like, how did they figure this out?
They were motivated.
It's all size, right?
More times on their hands.
Highly motivated.
You talk about very traditional whiskey making going back to the 1700s, right? Like, you could trace whiskey back for several hundred years because the batches were so much smaller. A lot of this stuff was just done by hand. So you basically have a person with a paddle stirring the water as they're extracting the sugars. But as the tanks get too big to reasonably do that by hand, again, this is very much the industrial age, right? Victorian age with the first industrial machines. The earliest versions of these were running off of water mills and turned on belts to crank the gears, right? They were all pretty mechanical. They've just been modernized from there. But that's, trying to make consistent whiskey. And the particular whiskey I picked this time, and I always pick it because it's a relation to this. It's a whiskey it's called Springbank, the distillery, and it's in Campbellton. Now, most folks don't know Campbellton. When you think about, we talk about 6 whiskey regions. So, and there's the ones everybody knows: the Highlands, the Speyside, the Lowlands. Islay is its own thing. And there's a group they call the Islands, so that's Jura and Arran and where's Talisker on Skye, up in the Orkneys, so forth. That's sort of the collectively known the islands. Islay, also an island, but so significant in the space, it's basically considered its own category. But near Islay and some of the islands is a peninsula in the southern part of Scotland called Campbellton. It's actually the southern edge of Campbellton is the closest approach to Ireland you can get. And it once was a very major whiskey producing area with over 30 distilleries. At the moment, it has 3. And one of them, arguably the most popular one, is Springbank. The other 2 are Glengline and Glen Scotia, both of which I've had an opportunity to sample. What's interesting about Springbank is that they use a completely original mash tun. So it is literally a cast iron Victoria era tank with no top. They don't worry about the heat loss in that. They haven't dressed it up and so forth. It's very fundamental. And their Springbank they make every year, and it's a 10-year-old. It's really basic whiskey, no filtration, no color manipulation. They do a light peating, so when they're drying their malt, they'll do 6 hours of the drying with peat, and then another 24 with just hot air. So it adds a little bit of the peat flavor, but not too much. The traditional, their usual 10, they tend to age in bourbon barrels because they're inexpensive, although they occasionally will use something else. So there has been sherry casks used. There are also cherry casks used. The 2020 edition of the Springbank won a ton of awards. And at the time, it was about $50. It was a bargain for what it was. The current edition now, if you can find it, it's over $100.
I think Paul would like this because, yes, sherry and bourbon, but also salted caramel and toffee.
I'm a little concerned about the peat, but it sounds like it's not too much.
It's a very mild peat.
It sounds very sweet too, which is interesting.
It's a pretty approachable whiskey, but for the effort you'll take to find it, and it's not inexpensive, it's almost not worth the effort.
Yeah.
Right.
Except if you're a whiskey aficionado, there are not a lot of Campbelltons. And so if you're going to try the different regions, like if you tell me, well, which Campbellton should I get? I'd say get the Springbank 10. Because while it's still difficult to find, it's only $100. How about the
cask strength 12? That might be
but
more.
I'm sure. Yeah, I think that'd be a ton of fun, right? And it's a straight bourbon, potent.
Yeah.
Right. If we could, again, we'd have to hunt it down. Easier to find in Scotland than it is to find elsewhere. But there's always a lot of conversation when Springbank is running a batch because they don't run round the clock. Like when I was talking about the mash tun and how they'll take the sparge from the previous batch and they'll go right in the next batch, because many of these distilleries now are 24-hour-a-day operations where they are always working grist constantly.
Right.
Springbank is not that kind of distillery. They make smaller quantities and they don't do near as much. That 30-year-old Springbank there you're looking at, that's probably a $2,000 bottle of whiskey.
Oh my!
You only make 1,400 bottles of it, right? So that is a pretty narrow run, and they're just scarce. It's a very fun version of the of whiskey. It's an unusual, like very small region today that has its own style, but it does speak to this particular set of effort. And at this point, we have now made wort, so we can now go off with some hops and a little bit of work and we'll do some fermentation and make some beer, or we can go make whiskey with it. And so the next conversation is going to be about fermentation.
Wow. This is really cool. I want to go on the distillery tour.
Mm-hmm.
That would be so cool. I take it you've done that. Yeah.
I've done a bunch of them. Remember, there's 60 plus distilleries still on operation in Scotland. Most do not have tours.
Yeah.
The ones that do, they're well worth going to, but you can only do 2 or 3 of them in a day before you get burned out.
Yeah. Or drunk off your ass.
Well, more you can't feel your face.
Right? Man, I want to try this. It looks really good.
It's a fun whiskey.
Yeah, it looks really good. Richard Campbell has done it again. runasradio.com for Run As Radio and .net Rocks. He's in Wales, be back in town next week, back in BC. Coquitlam. Thank you, Richard.
My pleasure.
Great stuff. I get thirsty every time I do this show.
We'll have to put together a collection of all the whiskeys we've pulled, right? And
we could sell it, and just a 20% markup, we'd make millions.
Since we're doing this, I should mention that there is a corn-based alcohol here in Mexico called Nixta, which, as you can see, comes in a corn-shaped bottle.
Isn't that cute?
It has a distinct corn taste, which is a little strange.
Good. No, it sounds good.
It's fun in cocktails.
I like it. Yeah. And you happen to have it right to hand, which is interesting.
It's weird that it happens to be one right here.
You keep it close.
In his desk drawer.
I didn't think it was going to to be that close.
That's Paul Thurrott.
It's evening here in Wales, so I will be down to the sequel bits reception.
I hope there's a big stone fireplace with wooden tables that have been there 100 years, and there's a nice glass of something sitting.
So must be. What is it? What time is it there? 9:45ish.
It's not quite that late. Yeah, 8:45.
8:45. Okay. All right, because UK. Yeah, 5 hours. Yeah.
But we are staying at a place called The Manor.
I love it.
As you thought, the big stone fireplace.
Love it.
I'm so jealous.